Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is Herman from Invest Hong Kong. Welcome to our webinar titled Navigating Environment, Social and Governance Issues. Invest Hong Kong is a department of the Hong Kong government. We are responsible for promoting Hong Kong as the foreign direct investment destination. As an international financial center, Hong Kong has the potential to be a global ESG investment hub. Therefore, we organize this seminar as part of our efforts to promote ESG development in Hong Kong. We are very delighted that we have three very professional and qualified speakers on this webinar. So let me introduce them to you. Ms. Karen Ho. Karen is an enterprise relationship manager for the asset owners and managers at Bloomberg in Hong Kong. She is also the head of APAC ESG sales strategy, bringing Bloomberg data analytics, research, and technical solutions to clients. Secondly, we have Werner Lin. Werner is the head of GRI's Greater China Research Regional Hub. She is an experienced sustainability and investment management professional. And lastly, we have Mr. Florian Bird. Florian is currently a researcher at MIT Sloan School of Management. His research interests cover sustainable investment with a focus on ESG ratings and how it affects investments. So now I would like to pass it on to our first speaker, Karen.
Thank you, Herman. Let me just share the screen right now. Cool. Thank you for giving me the opportunity in Invest Hong Kong. I would just like to spend a few minutes to talk about the ESG landscape in APAC in Hong Kong. Also, I will spend some time to talk about the opportunities that you have and other tools that Bloomberg provide and solutions that we can actually help you to invest better in ESG space. Today, as you know, this webinar is hosted by Invest Hong Kong. I thought it's very important for us to understand the ESG regulation developments and landscape in Hong Kong to start with. As you can see from this slide, you can see that in the past 2 years, there's huge development and focus from the Hong Kong regulators. This is a chart actually produced by SFC. They mentioned about 2 years ago where they start to have the strategic framework of green finance. And also by a few months later, they actually published a circular to provide the disclosure guidance for SFC authorized funds with the ESG focus or green funds focus. And then moving on after a few months' time, they actually worked with the Hong Kong Exchange on a consultation, and also I was publishing up about the new ESG disclosure requirement for the issuers, that is the corporations. After a few months' time, the government actually announced that the cross-agency steering group jointly by SFC and Hong Kong X with Hong Kong MA to coordinate the management of the climate and environmental risks faced by financial sectors. So as you can see, ESG risk or climate risk become part of the financial risk, and SFC just launched a consultation paper for the fund managers to actually look at the climate-related risk and disclosure just 2 weeks ago. As you can see from this order development in the past 2 years, this is a huge focus on ESG in Hong Kong. But Hong Kong is not just the only one. But why do they keep mentioning about the climate risk? This chart actually is quoted from the World Economic Forum of Global Risk Landscape 2020. We can talk about, look at the likelihood and the impact of different risks that we actually always mention in the market. As you can see, not a surprise, in the top right corner, it shows you that natural disaster, extreme weather, biodiversity loss, and all the environmental disaster, climate action failure, or the biggest risk that everyone faces nowadays. So that's actually explain why the exchange and the regulators are all talking about climate right now. This slide, also from the Bloomberg research team, Bloomberg Intelligence, shows you the top countries emitters for carbon. And then you can see where each country start to actually have some new target of carbon neutral. China just announced it about 2 months ago. And then you can see from APAC, different countries like India, Japan, and South Korea, they all have already set a carbon neutral target. And you can see the target years, although it's 2020 now, we have 40 years or 30 years on the road to achieve that. but that's actually, we have to expedite the speed and of the emissions reductions by different countries. This is a quote from the Bloomberg New Energy Finance research that we talk about the net zero carbon goals announcement by China, Japan, and South Korea. As all you can see, like there's actually a huge impact. I'm not going to read word by word, but you can see every country, even Asia, are taking it very seriously about climate and carbon goals. And that becomes a huge topic and trend, the most popular trend ever that I hear from the market in the financial industry. All the regulators, not just for Hong Kong, you can see, like for Hong Kong, we have SFC, and then we have also like from Japan, from South Korea, from Singapore, Malaysia, Australia, New Zealand. These are the countries where they have all the regulators start to focus a lot on TCFD and also the related climate disclosure. The stock exchange across the globe also actually ramping up the ESG requirements for all the companies. As you can see from this table, Australia, China, Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore, you name it in APAC, they're all having this requirement for part of the listing rules. Some of them are explicitly listed in the listing rule. Some of them are more focusing on about like whether they have guidance to companies to have the ESG reporting or over even the ESG training. So you can see there's no excuse for companies not to report on ESG or take it seriously on ESG risk management. Moving on, I just want to quickly actually show you like the latest ESG consultation paper that I just firstly mentioned. SFC just launched a consultation paper for fund managers to take climate risk into consideration for the investment and risk management process. That means the investors no longer can just claim that they have like take into ESG into considerations. There's no greenwashing that could happen, and they have to take it seriously to look at individual companies, how they're performing in terms of ESG. So now, why I'm here, why am I speaking? Because like in the market, as you can see, we have this huge focus on ESG and climate, and we need a lot of different participants in the market to play an important role. Bloomberg is the strongest in our data. So with the ESG data as aggregator, then we can provide a lot of like new insight to investors or even corporations to make better informed decisions. So we are strongest in terms of the data coverage. We actually also built up the maturity map for different industries to understand ESG much more effectively, look at more important issues. We also have news coverage as Bloomberg is a news agency regarding ESG topics. We also produce ESG research and also help different companies to deploy the technology that they need to actually integrate ESG into workflow, either for corporations or for the buy side or the sell side. We talk about the ESG data. Why is it important? A lot of people just mentioned about the factors that are stopping the growth of ESG, the market, is because of the limitation of data. But Bloomberg helped you to actually solve this issue. We cover about 11,000 companies. We cover all the different data points that is disclosed by companies, which later on, Berna, the other speaker, will also mention about the importance of having standard and aggregated data. Also, there's some third-party scores Bloomberg also carries about, like, for example, Sustainalytics, MSCI, IIS. These are the third-party ESG rating agency where the other speaker, Florian, later on will actually tell us more about the research. For a standard ESG target operating model by different buy-side firms or even corporations, this is kind of like a standard kind of process that they will go through, either looking at the third-party ESG ratings or build their own internal screenings using negative screening or positive best-in-class screening, and also build an ESG framework to actually think about what they have to do as a company, what they have to do with managing ESG risk, or as an investor, how do they actually manage the portfolios. Bloomberg have a solution for all of them. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just let you know. If you're interested, let me know. I would also just like to spend another 2 minutes just to talk about the latest about ESG, like what we see in a different country level or even industry level, to share by sharing some of the Bloomberg news and research. On the slide, you can see that just like as of last week, China urged to steps to reduce emissions for some of the cities where they have seen a large increase on air pollution. And you can see that like this is very tiny about like what the China talk about the reduction of carbon emissions. Also, like on the right, you can talk about like some of the policy by UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and what they're trying to do to actually hold the gas emissions for metro cars. Also, like I think the top topic right now is the U.S. Elections. So we also have like talk about if there's like John Biden is actually elected to be like the president, then there will be a more progressive climate policy, and that will boost the support for climate actions globally and even from the U.S. And also, like with this, then actually who will be benefited? That would be the solar sector in China. It's actually one of the industry that would clearly benefit from this. Today, later on, we will also discuss about like what has changed after COVID-19, like some of the scenarios happen to different countries, what would be the changes of the indicator. According to Bloomberg Intelligence Research, we noticed that for different countries, some of the social indicators, social issues out of the ESG will be a focus after COVID. And also the carbon transitions, where we touched mentioned about all the climate policy changes, the emissions done by different sectors like chemicals or oil and gas. This will be something that they will have to innovate new technology to help them to transition to the new circular economy. And also, last but not least, green finance, green bonds, green loans, sustainability-linked loans or bonds. That is something that I've been issuing in the past 2 to 5 years, as you can see from the chart. But you can see that like in different key countries like China, Japan, and Hong Kong, you can see the growth. COVID-19 definitely slowed down a lot of issues from this pandemic. If you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me by this email or connect me with LinkedIn. Thank you.
Hello. So shall we just start my session? Thank Karen for her presentation, and hi everyone. My name is Verna Lin. I'm in charge of GRI's Global China Regional Hub. So GRI is, as everybody knows, it's a global standard setter for sustainability disclosure. If we can move on to the next slide. Next, please. So today I wanted to actually introduce some information about GRI, what we do and what we can help the corporates or entities around the world in terms of ESG disclosure. So GRI is an independent international organization. We provide global common language for corporate transparency. And basically we help business and other organizations, including the governments or any types or any size of entities actually to communicate their sustainability impact with their stakeholders. And so the central products or the standards we have is so-called the GRI Standards, which is the world's most widely adopted sustainability reporting standards. And we provide it as a public good. Next slide. So if we look back how we all started, it's actually already been 20 something years ago. Start from 1997, started with an initiative in Boston, but then the organization relocated to the Netherlands. So over the years, we've been strive and provided the markets with the sustainability disclosure. So for instance, in 2013, there's like G4. And then in 2016, we have this G1, G2, G3, G4. And then in 2016, we changed into the so-called well-known GRI standards. Next slide. So where we are, so the headquarters itself, now it's still based in the Netherlands, Amsterdam. And we have 7 regional hubs, including in North America. And then there's in Singapore, ASEAN country, South Africa, and then there's also South Asia. So the Greater China Regional Hub is based in Hong Kong, and the Greater China Regional Hub include obviously 4 different jurisdictions. That's Hong Kong, Mainland China, Taiwan, and then Macau. That includes the 4 jurisdictions, and they also comprise 3 very different capital markets. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. Next slide. So what is the GRI standards? And the GRI standards represent the global best practice for reporting your impact. What does that mean? So for instance, when we are talking about the UN sustainability goal, or when we are talking about climate change, we wanted to know what is the impact of a company's business toward the economy, society, and environment. So we wanted to understand what is, how your company's business contribute directly or indirectly toward climate change. So it's very important to understand that our approach is to emphasize the impact inward. The impact outward, not the other way around. So we always adopt a so-called multi-stakeholder approach. That means we don't develop the GRI standards by ourselves. We always include during the process the involvement of civil society, the business enterprise, including also the investment institutions and labor organizations or government officials. So that would help, take into account everybody's perspective. And so we would always have this robust multi-stakeholder when we are developing or improving the GRI standards. Next slide. So just have give everybody an overview about the GRI standards. So you could see from the left side, there's like 3 universal standards which applies to every entity when they are doing the GRI report. So the GRI 101 is called the foundation, and it's basically the starting point of using the GRI standards. It sets out the reporting principles for defining report contents and qualities. They include the requirement for preparing your sustainability report in accordance with the GRI standard. And the second is, the general disclosure. So the general disclosure, GRI 102, helps sets out the reporting requirement on contextual information about an organization and its reporting practice. And they could be used by any organization of any size, type, sector, or geographic locations, no matter you are based in Europe, in the US, or in Asia. The third of GRI 103 is so-called management approach. And the management approach basically sets out a reporting requirement about how an organization manage a material topic, which is actually an essential part of how you assess your impact, right? So on the right-hand side of topic-specific standards, when after the universal standard and organization, during the process, when you are already having the 101, 102, and 103, then you move on to have the so-called materiality assessment. And then in the process, you would identify specific topic that is material to your organization. So for instance, water might be a material topic to one company, but not to another company, right? So the topic specific standard help you to select your material topics as your reporting, like sustainability reporting output. Next slide. So I wanted to, so let's, if we take a look of the global influence of our GRI standards, there's about like 160 policies in over 60 countries and regions reference or require GRI as their reporting standards. And obviously the number is always changing. And for GRI, we constantly working closely with the governments, the regulators, and corporate itself around the world to advocate for the adoption of the GRI standards. Next slide. So just have a quick look. For instance, the global largest 250 companies in the world, about 80-something% of them are adopting the GRI standards. So it is basically it's providing a global common languages. So for companies that it's trying to make itself into an international platform, the GRI standard would help to communicate their sustainability impact with their overseas investors. Next slide. And so when Karen just mentioned, it will be quite interesting for everybody to take a look of this so-called ESG reporting landscape. So if we look at the second box, it's actually the standards and frameworks. And if you look at the left, the box on the left-hand side, the so-called reporter issuers, it's basically those corporates, right? Those corporates or entities who actually issue sustainability report, and they would start with adopting standards, for instance, the GRI standards. And there's also in the in ESG landscape, we also have data aggregators. We have agencies providing analysis and ratings, and we have so-called data consumers. Who are those data consumers? That is basically the investors, for instance. That's the fund managers, or that's actually different stakeholders. So we constantly work with every different players in this landscape to advance the sustainability agenda. Next slide. So for instance, like Bloomberg, it's one of the data aggregator. And then another of our speakers today, a researcher from MIT, is also an important academic circle that provided research. And then, so this is kind of the whole ESG industry. And basically it's just to tell us, it's a complex issue, and we need everybody to play a role and facilitate the markets. So yeah, let's say an overview of the ESG industry. Next slide. So GRI, as a global standard setter, there are certain things we do, and there are certain things we do not do. For instance, as a standard setter, in order to maintain our neutral position, we don't certify, we don't evaluate, and we don't endorse. But we do providing a reporting standard, reporting tool. And then our team in the Netherlands, we actually provide reporting services. So for the market, some companies, they might engage with accounting firm to help with their GRI standard report, or they could also approach our GRI team in our headquarters, and we provided different report services, such as our team would provide a materiality check, and we will look at your GRI index and give you actual comments from the GRI's perspective. We also provided training. So we don't train individuals, but we do have globally many different certified training partners to provide training courses of the GRI standards to individuals. We do launched a new GRI Academy. So it's combined online platform for individuals to do it via online learning courses. And then we also have the GRI community. So we are quite actively inviting different entities and companies around the world to join our GRI communities. Next slide. And that's just a very light and short introduction of the GRI Secretariat and the GRI Standards. And look forward to our panel discussion later. Thank you.
Hi, so my name is Florian. I'm a researcher at MIT, and I've been doing research in that space for a fairly long time. As a matter of fact, I wrote my PhD about the link between ESG, so sustainability performance and financial performance in portfolios 10 years ago. And since then, actually, nothing has really changed in terms of the main critique we hear about the whole field, and that's data. Everyone who came across a sustainability rating, I mean, there's obviously, it's not easy to come up with a sustainability rating. And if I would ask you, you would definitely, every one of you would probably have different ways of constructing it, because we have different topics that are more important for us or less important for us. For example, some think that CO2 emissions more important, other would think gender bias is more important. And so that's why we call our project Aggregate Confusion, because there's a lot of aggregation in there and hence confusion. And my goal is now in the next 10 minutes to disaggregate a little bit that confusion in your mind and give you a framework of how to think about it. And we actually quantitatively will support that. So, as I said, you heard probably of ESG ratings, and you heard that there's low correlation. And as a matter of fact, it's true. If you look at here, those 6 raters we looked at, and 6 of the leading ESG raters, the average correlation is maybe, what, 60%? And between some raters it's more. For example, between Visio Iris and RobecoSAM, it's 70, or Sustainalytics is 71%. And between others, MSCI and RobecoSAM, it's only 38%. So yeah, what we did is actually, we tried to figure out why do those raters actually disagree. And in our paper, you can download that and you can look at it. We detail why they not correlate much more. We have 10 pages about this. I just but I just want to show you the highlights of our paper. So in our framework, we actually have 3 sources of disagreement, of what we call divergence. And one is the scope divergence. That is, do I include when I measure sustainability, when I want to create one ESG, one sustainability rating, what do I measure? Do I measure CO2 emissions? Probably yes. Do I measure gender bias? Probably yes. Do I measure electromagnetic fields? Maybe. If you're in the S, probably not. You see all the overland lines across just next to my house. I see that. But I was born in Germany, and in Germany, for us, electromagnetic fields and electromagnetic smog is actually a big thing, a big topic in the media. So it turns out that actually as a German rater, as a European, as a French rater, I would probably include it. Then the next source of divergence is weights. Weights is what I said. It's basically the relative importance of such an indicator, of such a topic. For example, if I have CO2 emissions and gender bias, what is more important to me? And the third one is measurement. How do I measure actually CO2 emissions? How do I measure, do I look at scope 1, scope 2? Or actually, do I include also scope 3 emissions? Do I, for those who know what I mean, when I look at gender bias, how do I measure gender bias? Do I look at the differences in salaries between women and men, or do I look at the promotions? How many promotions women get compared to men? Those actually probably what you want is actually you want a proxy, you want to measure the same thing. So you want to measure how women are treated in the workforce, but you use different proxies, different indicators to measure that. So you will actually disagree. And so what we did is we compared, actually, we mapped all those information we got from all those 6 raters and different categories. Here I show you the 26 categories from SASB, but we actually use, this is just because it's easier to show. We actually, in our own mapping, we have 64 categories. And when now we're actually able to compare the data, and what you see is that there's actually correlation is actually even lower. You see, for example, one of the higher correlations is energy management between KL and MS. KL means KLD, MS means MSCI. It's 80%. That is fairly high. It's most likely because they use the same raw data, because KLD and MSCI are from the same service provider. They're just different data sets. But now you look at, for example, the red one on the bottom, selling practices and product labeling. Indeed, this comes from the minus 38% here come from product marketing. So marketing practices. One marketing practice could be, do you actually, when you sell your tobacco, do you target, or alcohol, do you target young adults or even younger people, 15, 16-year-old teenagers in your ads? That would be, for example, deemed a bad practice. And now you see a correlation of minus 38% between KLD and Rebecca Sam. That is actually, yeah, it's quite fascinating to see that those different raters come to completely opposite conclusions. Minus 50% here between KLD and Sustainalytics. So what we did, and we used a lot of math and did run 2 different algorithms in order to prove that our results are actually robust, and found actually that measurement is the highest divergence, source of divergence, followed by scope and weights. So how you measure is the most important source of disagreement. Do you measure it? It's the scope, and what the relative importance is a little bit less. So with our methodology now, if you compare one company from 2 different raters, you can actually answer why those ratings are different. So if you look at Asset 4 KLD, but you could also say Sustainalytics and MSCI, and you look at Barrick Gold Corporation, you can see that actually here, most of the difference is the blue in the middle, and that is measurement noise, and it's about remuneration. So Asset 4 and KLD disagree about how to measure the remuneration practices of Barrick Gold Corporation. So this actually, as you see, it's a little bit less, weight is a little bit less, and scope is even less difference. And in scope, the biggest difference is actually board, how you actually, how you look at the board independence. A big one for weight is community and society. So one actually includes community and society, the other one doesn't, less with weight. So this is actually a tool you can use, basically. If you recode and recode the algorithm, you can actually, as a company or as an investor, you can find out what the differences are between the ESG raters. And as, so yeah, So this is the framework I wanted to give you in order, how to approach this rated disagreement. And if you sum up for the sources of divergence, you can actually even say scope and weights. So the question if I include something, and the question what the relative importance is what my perception is of sustainability. Measurement is something how I measure it. So that's a little bit different. So a big part actually of the disagreement comes from how I perceive sustainability. And that, as I said in the beginning, is different among everyone. So the disagreement in the beginning is actually not as bad as if you explain it, as if you looked at just at the headline correlations that I showed you in the beginning. So I think that is it. I will stop. I know I have 1 more minute. No, I would stop now. Thank you for everything, and I will ask your question at the end after the panel discussion.
Thank you, Florian, and thank you, Verna, very much for your presentation. So we'll move on to the panel discussion right now. So I will be the moderator. But first of all, just a recap of what we discussed so far. First of all, I gave an overview about the ESG landscape in Hong Kong and APAC and the global trend of the country's policy, the circular economy, and the carbon transitions. And Verna explained the important role of GRI placed in the ESG industries as a reporting standard. Florian moved on to actually share his research finding on the ESG rating agency, how we can approach looking at the ratings. In this panel discussion, we would like to discuss further on how we can move forward on this growing trend of ESG so our audiences can capitalize these upcoming opportunities. So the first question that I have to Verna is, what I understand is that ESG issues are very heavily policy driven in APAC, quite different from US and Europe. What's GRI's role in terms of pushing for this ESG development, and how you're doing in terms of policy advocacy?
Yeah, thanks, Karen, for the question. So indeed, what I just mentioned earlier, it's there are 4 jurisdictions in Greater China region and 3 different capital markets. So they are very unique. Each capital market, we are talking about mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. These 3 capital markets, they are very unique in terms of structure, the composition, how the regulators regulate, and how sustainability of ESG evolved over time. What do I say? For instance, in Greater China, in mainland China, for instance, they are still calling CSR because start from 20 years ago, some company has already doing the sustainability disclosure. And 20 years ago, the term ESG has not yet been invented. I think some people might not be aware of that. So the structure, why they call CSR in terms of ESG is because 20 years ago, you are looking at this from very corporate perspective. But now, since the UN's SDGs and everybody is jumping into this sustainability agenda, everything is converging. What I mean is now China is also looking at, maybe they might change or not change the sustainability term into ESG. That doesn't matter. But then, so if we look at the structure of Hong Kong, so Hong Kong start from the beginning, maybe 5-6 years ago, as giving the structure of Hong Kong as a financial hub. In the beginning, they used the term ESG because ESG was coined in the beginning from investors' perspective, right? So in Taiwan also adopt the term of CSR for the same reason. If you look at Taiwan's stock exchange composition, 60 or 70% of the TWSE is manufacturing or technology sector. So they give it a little bit reason why there's a different terms like each capital market adopts. But again, it doesn't matter because whether you call CSR, ESG, or sustainability reporting, everything is converging. Okay, so in terms of how we do policy advocacy, so specifically in mainland China, we understand like the everything in mainland China, it's sort of top down, right? So the market has to, in a way, follow the policy regulators' regulations. Yeah, so the way we work with them is we provided so-called linkage document. So in China, there are some sort of local framework developed by CASS. So GRI work with CASS, and then we provided a linkage document to facilitate the market for cross-reference between the local framework and the GRI standards. That's one way of how we do policy advocacy. The other way would be we also keep the communication channel with Shanghai Exchange open. So whenever there's an opportunity, we provide the communication and input from GRI's perspective. And as in terms of Hong Kong, very different from China. Hong Kong, it's always like industry driven. So in a way, the investment industry and finance sectors would lead the way of the ESG innovation, right? But then as a regional global financial center, Hong Kong Exchange, like what Karen just mentioned, they also have the ambitious plan to turn Hong Kong into a ESG hub. So we also, for us to work with Hong Kong Exchange and the regulators, we would, provided our input when they are conducting Hong Kong's ESG disclosure, for instance, and we also provided the linkage document. So GRI would be like, as Hong Kong have their own ESG guide. In the ESG guide, there's like a section about the international framework. So GRI would be one of that to, provide the perspectives from a global standard setters point of view. And in terms of Taiwan, Taiwan is very different and is somewhere in between. The structure of Taiwan is very different. So it's like the regulators and the sector, the industry itself work sort of hand in hand. And from 2016, the Taiwan Exchange actually required the companies to adopt the GRI standards. So for us, it's like, we work with them in a very different way. So, we like, so one of my responsibility would be to develop different strategies and work with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Verna. Very in-depth discussion about like how you engage with different countries on like driving this ESG disclosure and promoting the standard. So the next topic that I want to move on is more related to COVID-19. This year has been remarkable. Like there's a lot of changes, like everything changed our life, the way that we do business. So I want to hear from both Verna and Florian of how you noticed about the changes of different stakeholders. How do they react to COVID-19 and in regards to ESG? Like have they changed the way they approach different companies? So I want to hear from maybe Florian first about like what you see from this kind of ESG rating agencies or the ratings.
Yeah, of course. I mean, COVID is a big challenge, right? And it's actually, since there's a lot of regulation planned on ESG rating agencies and disclosure and all that, it actually reminds us that how dynamic the concept of an ESG rating is. A lot of people approached it until fairly recently that there was divergence, but and we should maybe they were saying, I heard a lot of people saying that we should just we should set in stone the scope and the weights, so what we measure and how important it is relatively to others. But I think that obviously we shouldn't do that, because COVID reminds us how important it is to see that materiality, as we call it, changing over time. Now health and safety is much more important in factories than it was a year ago. But it's not only COVID, it's also Black Lives Matter in the US, right? That changed a lot how we perceive minorities, that accelerated that. Also the discussion about climate change in the last 2-3 years. I remember 10 years ago, we did not discuss as much climate change as 2-3 years ago. And also gender bias. Those are all topics that become more important. And I think then when they are more important, then there will be also a bigger risk in terms of financial return. And so that actually those ESG rating agencies have to reflect that. And I think it is very important that we also shape future regulation in a way that they will be able to do that, because I think it's one of the most important jobs. ESG raters should not only measure data, but they should also give an interpretation of what they think is important.
Thank you. Serna, did you see some changes in different stakeholders' engagements, and how do they look at materiality as well?
Yeah, of course. But I will just be very brief to provide some thoughts based on what Florian just mentioned. So obviously, the pandemic sort of provide an opportunity, right, for us to reconsider what is important. And so GRI conduct some research back in July and August, and based on our research, a lot of reporters, they actually say one interesting is their sustainability team. They've never been invited to their top management meeting, but suddenly business contingency plan become a sustainability issue. So then they were invited to their board meeting. So what's important, it's like we look at how business develop their business contingency plan and managing their risk management. So when you are doing sustainability reporting, it's always not about the report itself. So report is an output, but more importantly, is how during the process you work with different stakeholders and internally your different departments and to collect the sustainability data and your company's materials topics. So after pandemic, there will be more diversified and reassess what is material to your firm. And so we also call for more transparency during the process. And then also when you are engaged with your stakeholders, they might change into a remote way. So they also call for innovation in terms of how you engage with your stakeholders.
Very interesting. So ESG is finally back to the table on the board level. So Florian, you just mentioned about the regulations part as well. So Verna talked about the policy advocacy that she's been doing in Greater China region. But can you tell us more about what do you anticipate about the future and the regulations about the ESG rating agency? How to actually should we actually what will they be expecting?
Yeah, so I think one of the big problems that we encountered in our paper, and that's how I gauged a little bit that path, and I've been talking a lot to regulators in Europe and all sorts of levels about that, because in Europe there's this drive to regulate ESG rating agencies, and I think so what we saw is that it was, even for us as researchers, really hard to get down to the data, really, and to the really raw data of for our analysis. So what we wanted is, what we realized, this field needs much more transparency on the raw data level. So because since those ESG rating agencies don't show that, don't have that that transparency, I think the space lacks competition, and competition is what the space needs in order to improve measurement practices. Not so much scope and weight, but especially measurement practices, because we still have a lot of noise. And I'll show that in a new paper that I put on SSRN in a couple of weeks. about noise. But I think this is one of the biggest angles that we should really, the future regulation should really increase transparency. And there is actually, I think my voice was a little bit hurt. And actually people start now realizing that this is the most important topic. One other is obviously also that a lot of ESG raters offer consulting services in order how to actually have a better rating. And like in investment banking, it should be very separate, the rating business from the consulting business. I think those are the two the most important access way future regulation will do something good. And just as another point of view, because we have Werner here, so ESG rating regulation is obviously different from disclosure from on the corporate side. And I think they go hand in hand. So if we actually have mandatory minimum disclosure on the corporate side through GRI or SASB, and then we actually, or CDP, then we actually, we can actually, those ESG raters can use that data and build on it, improve measurement practices in the future through enhanced competition. And then we can actually look at those ESG raters again and can maybe increase the minimum disclosure in 10 years or 5 years, because we saw that there were some best practices emerging. So I think that there's actually a lot of things we can leverage in the future.
Very interesting
yes.
point.
And I mean, there's much more to talk about, obviously, and I could talk another hour about regulation.
Definitely.
Also.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I'm sure the ESG rating agency will want to hear from you more about like what will be the future 5-10 years ago, but down the road. But I think like a lot of us, the audience, actually from the investment side as well. So just want to hear from your advice, like how should we approach these ESG ratings as an investor? What will you be like, maybe like 2 biggest tips that you can give us?
Yeah, I think so. What's very important is that you know your rating agency. You just don't buy ESG ratings just because you think MSCI is good from the outside. You have to really go in. You have to read about the methodology and you have to do your due diligence. And if you agree with those values, most of the big asset managers, now I'm talking about small asset managers, but most of the big asset managers, they already have teams where they buy actually not the ESG ratings, but they buy the raw data from, let's say, Asset4 Refinitiv, from Bloomberg. Then they get the raw data from MSCI, and then they combine them in their own way, what they think is important. So they kind of create their own scope and weights, set of scope and weights. And I think that is definitely, I mean, a great way to do it if you have the resources. But there's a lot of smaller and asset managers that are new to this, they will just probably buy the ESG rating, which is completely fine as well. But in order to defend it, if an investor asks you, or if someone asks you, actually the client asks you why you actually have this ESG rating, then it would be good to know what the what is actually really in there. So you have to. There is a cost to, and there's a cost to doing ESG, for sure.
Good to hear. So, so Werner, as GRI is a standard, without a standard, we don't have the data. But like in your kind of like opinion, what would be, what would you suggest the investment to do, like to under this divergence of different ESG ratings out there in the market? What would be your, how can GRI help us?
Okay, so like what Florian just mentioned is actually one particular point is very interesting to me. It's you actually look into the methodology, not just, you know, buying data because what you look at in the surface. But as a global standard setter, like I mentioned before, there are certain things we don't do. For instance, we don't certify, evaluate, or endorse, right? So what GRI would always do is to continually providing the unique approach, the whole thing, adopting our multi-stakeholder approach. And then one particular interest from the market obviously is the harmonization. So I wanted to add on what the discussion earlier is actually what is really interesting here is because there is no a single there's no single thing right now. Like it's a process, right? So we look at something, obviously we wanted to have a set of standard. So what GRI would do during the process, we do our part and work with other standard setter in terms of providing the harmonization. That's one thing. The second thing is we continually providing the advocacy, for instance, towards the a great game changer. It's the European Union's Green Deal that is coming to impact a lot of people, and so so my suggestion would be, like, as a standard setter, like obviously we don't provide the a very quick rating service to the market, right? So that's why there's important players such as researchers, like research institutions as MIT or Bloomberg, existed also in the whole sustainability landscape. So what we do with is GRI will continue to work with everybody in this field.
Thank you, Verna. So we do have some time for Q&A. So please use your chat on this Zoom page to actually type your questions. We already got like 1 or 2 questions, so please feel free to add it too. But while commenting on Verna's and also Florian's kind of answers to some of the questions, I do see that each one of us actually play a very important role at this to promote market transparency. You can see the regulators are trying to ramp up on more kind of standards in terms of disclosure, and also even for the rest of the market, Bloomberg, for us, we actually help companies to actually look at the data and compare to peers. While with the GRI standard, you can see that companies start to report more data, more useful data, so the investors can actually use that, and then actually also encourage companies to start reporting following GRI, so they can compare apple to apple. While Florence insight about the different ESG data ratings could actually be a complex process to understand it, but once you understand it, it's so much easier for you to actually understand why is it diverse. So so without further ado, I might just want to ask one of the questions from the floor. So Verna, what are the ESG opportunities in Hong Kong? It's kind of generic questions, but if you can share some of your views, please.
Well, I think this question might be even better for Invest Hong Kong to address. From my over 10 years in the city, right? Hong Kong has always the advantage of Hong Kong as a financial hub, including our very solid legal system, and obviously the financial industry infrastructure. So it's really a generic question. So I think ESG is a revolution, and now it's sort of the right time to apply it and change every aspect of different sectors. Right.
Yeah.
So from investment side, it's responsible investment. From corporate side, it's you kind of start reporting ESG, and then so many accounting consultants in Hong Kong is to help different clients in terms of how to write a report or rating. So I think Hong Kong have all the elements required.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I see Herman coming joining in.
Maybe
hopefully you can answer this question and
maybe I'll just a little bit. Thank you very much. As Verna rightly put it, Hong Kong is an international financial center, so we do have a very wide spectrum of professionals and financial institutions in Hong Kong, and they provide a very wide range of products. And starting to have ESG related products for investor to invest into. So that's one thing that we are trying to develop. I mean, also with stakeholders like Bloomberg providing data, analytical solutions to investor as well. I think another thing to point out is Hong Kong government also has a very keen to promote a green bond and promote Hong Kong as a green bond center, so that they have actually given a lot of incentives for corporates to issue green bonds from Hong Kong. Now, another opportunity for Hong Kong is to tap into the green bond market in China. I think at this moment, probably most of the investor into the Chinese green bond markets is the onshore investors. Now, how are we going to use Hong Kong as a step into the onshore green bond market into China is something that I think the whole community, the finance community, including our government, is trying to develop. So, we all know that the green bond market in China is one of the biggest in the world. So how overseas investor can use Hong Kong to tap into the green bond market in China is going to be the next big development. Thank you.
All right, that concludes the end of the webinar. Thank you, Invest Hong Kong. Thank you for the audiences. The three of us, the three speakers, will be happy to get your questions. If you want to send us an email, could you please show this slide? So you can contact us through LinkedIn or like send an email to us if you want to touch base later. So thank you for your time today. See you next time.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.